Good gravy. I've been trying to record this all day. Just waiting for a 3-year-old to finish a chocolate chip cookie, and it is a long process. So, I wanted to make this video just specifically for your class to address some of the sort of universal things that I was seeing in the planners. So, just a couple tips and heads up for you guys to keep in mind for the future. These are the kinds of things that I would say out loud if we were having face-to-face class, but we're not. They're the kind of things that I'd be like, oh, just so everybody knows. But we don't really get a chance to do that. So I'm making a video all about it. And I'm also subtitling this video, Why Am I So Mean? Because one of the things that I tried to do with the first planner, as many of you have noticed, is really be very particular and nitpicky and harsh even about grading your planner, because your planner is basically your draft of the paper. And your paper, the literature review paper, is going to be worth more points. And the literature review paper, really the topic and the questions that you ask set you up for the informative paper in Unit 2. So I really want to make sure that everybody's got a solid foundation going into this paper. So what I have here is something I want to talk about to explain a little bit if you're confused as to why I'm being so particular about the way that you phrase your topic or the questions that you're writing. This is an example of why it's important. So one of the things that I wanted to tell you about Unit 2, the Unit 2 paper you have, you're going to be writing an informative paper that's broken down into 3 subheadings. And those 3 subsections, the subheadings that you have in the paper, the subsections that you cover, are essentially going to be the researched answers to the questions you asked here. So if you have 3 questions that you asked in your literature review, the questions you really want to research, your paper and the informational paper is going to be you answering those questions, coming up with doing the research and then providing the answers to the questions. So if I told you that it didn't seem like your question would generate enough material, or it was too much of a yes or no question, it was too much of a quick fact question, that's why I said that, because you're going to want to be able to write probably for each section. Some sections will be longer than others, but for each section, you're going to want to write at least a page. You're going to want to be able to speak about this question for a bit of time in the information paper. So that's why it's so important. Another reason it's important to get it really clear on this level is because I'm noticing that as you're doing this work of exploring and figuring out topics and things like that, you might, in the course of your research, be realizing what your actual narrowed down focus is, and now is the time to nail that down. So I noticed in several planners a tendency to kind of come across a source that might bring in a different topic, and then to get a little bit almost distracted with the other topic instead of your focus. So yes, I am being like mean about this, but it's because I want you guys to really start seeing the importance of editing, because it's going to make your paper more organized and your life easier than if you're bringing in all these huge topics and trying to cover them all and feeling like you're not really covering any of them adequately, because that's certainly one of the things that can happen when you sort of bite off more than you can chew. When you have a topic that's too broad, or a topic that you're not really like focusing in on and reining in on. So I have this example. I'm going to say that this is my original. My original, I said my topic was the impacts of climate change on low-income communities. That's where I started. And that sounds pretty good. That's the kind of topic that I probably on that discussion board would have been like, yep, approved. Now that I have thought about it a little bit more, I'm going to narrow it down a little bit to make my life easier. And then the questions I came up with were, who is most impacted by climate change? What are the impacts of climate change? How does racism impact climate change? So let's say I found a source that talked about climate change and racism, and then I found another source that talked a little bit about climate change in general and what we're facing, because I was using the keywords climate change, but I wasn't necessarily focusing enough on my focus. I'm getting questions here that are going to be too big to manage. When you guys look at these questions, as critical thinkers, one of the things that I want you to work on is seeing how these questions need to be edited because they're going to send you in all different directions. And instead of having a paper that is focused on my focus of low-income communities, I'm going to be talking about all of the impacts of climate change. And then I'm going to be talking about how racism impacts climate change. And you can see that in these questions, I don't ever include the phrase, which is my focus, on low-income communities. So one thing to keep in mind is always put your focus first. Is your paper going to talk about climate change? Sure. Do you maybe need to have a quick background on climate change? Perhaps. Maybe a paragraph in the introduction, maybe a paragraph in the first section. But if I have set out and I've said, you know what, I'm going to focus on this particular aspect of climate change, all of my questions and all of my sources need to relate back to that. So this question, who is most impacted by climate change? Okay. That is a good place to start because that's going to give me a little bit of this the way of seeing the difference between low-income communities and middle class communities and upper class communities. This question works, except if I type maybe this question into Google, I might be getting information that's hits on the most impacted people who are most impacted are people who live in extremely close to the poles. So I might be out of nowhere reading an article about how people in Greenland are being impacted. When I type this in, I might be getting the entire world, that like people who are living in sub-Saharan Africa are the ones who are most impacted. That is probably going to be too much for me to cover in this paper. So if you look at my revision down here, I kept the same question, but I narrowed it to in the US. And I did that with my topic as well. Just as a reminder, oh yeah, make sure I'm looking for in the US. Because it's easy to type in a question like who is most impacted by climate change and find a great source or seemingly great source that we're sort of seduced by, only to realize that it's set in Australia. And you don't want to be kind of holding the whole world in your hands with these sources. You don't want to have to account for climate change in every country in the entire world. You don't want to have to deal with all of the impacts of climate change in the paper that is focusing on low-income communities. This is why the process of narrowing down is important. So here, what are the impacts of climate change? Okay. That is too broad of a question. I cannot possibly cover all of them and still deal with my focus. So what I've done for the revision is I've changed the question to single in on my focus. How is climate change impacting low-income communities? And if the sources I'm finding are just talking about the impacts of climate change in general, that source is probably too broad for my focus. Making this my target, what I'm really looking for, what I'm really searching for, is going to make my life easier. Is it going to make my search for sources harder? Possibly. Is it going to make my writing clearer when I go to write my paper? Absolutely. And that's what we're going for. And then here, this last question, how does racism impact climate change? Okay, so let's say you're searching and you find an article about this, of which I'm sure there are many. You're looking and you're finding this, and it's a really interesting part of the puzzle. And you're thinking, okay, I want to include this. That is a good way to go. But now you're bringing in a whole other dimension. There's nothing wrong with that, but it might be better to phrase it in a way where you're actually thinking about how to tie the things together. Because here, there's sort of an assumed link between the idea of racism and low-income communities, and you want to figure out a way to connect them entirely. So the question that I changed this to was, what are some of the causes for the disparity between low-income communities and other communities in terms of climate change? If you ask a question like that, then you're probably going to find that one of the answers is racism and possibly classism, okay? So those are some of the things that you're going to hear if you look these up. But this way, you're not introducing a whole new element. You're figuring out a way to ask a question that still ties back to your narrowed focus. And it will allow you to talk about this thing, but in a way that doesn't sort of make your paper go in a completely different direction. What we're doing right now is we are managing our papers. We're figuring out how to write a clear, organized paper about our topic. So I used this just as an example to see sort of the thinking process that I went through when I gave you suggestions in your planner feedbacks. The other things that I want to talk about super quickly are just an explanation of bias, because I saw a lot of responses about bias that I think were confusing bias with focus. So I just pulled up the definition of bias. Bias is a disproportionate weight in favor of or against an idea or thing, usually in a way that is closed-minded, prejudicial, or unfair. So that's what you're looking for when you're looking for bias. You're looking for something that's unfair. So it's not really a good indicator of bias to say, well, they didn't talk about this thing, because not every article can talk about everything that exists. If the focus of the article is to do like a case study in Philadelphia, you can't really fault it for not talking about what's going on in Wichita, because that's not the point. So bias isn't the same thing as focus. And what you're looking for with bias is more like, are the facts manipulated, or do they seem to get in the way? Are people like hiding the facts? That's what you're looking for with bias. You're looking for that extreme one-sidedness. It's not the same as if somebody's focused on studying a certain area, or they talk about a certain field and they don't mention other alternatives, or they don't mention other practices. That's not really bias. So bias isn't the same as having a different focus, or even thinking like in a source thinking differently than we do. That's not necessarily bias. It's bias when it's a disproportionate weight in favor of or against an idea or thing, usually in a way that is closed-minded, prejudicial, or unfair. And you're going to notice with bias, there's going to be lots of opinion as opposed to lots of fact. So you can read an article that has a strong opinion that some people disagree with. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily biased, as long as it has the facts that back it up. So that's one of the things you want to keep aware of when you're talking about bias. Another term to get straight is database. So a database is a structured set of data held in a computer. So the database is sort of like, when you're on the library databases, they're sort of like Google. So you wouldn't want to say in this database article. That would be like saying in this Google article. The database is the system that lets you find the article. But the article that you're probably talking about is a journal article, or a scholarly article. And I know that these are kind of random, but hopefully for some of you they'll be helpful. Last but not least, one of the things that's really irritating that authors do is sometimes they'll put their name in all caps, or they'll put their article title in all caps. You don't need to leave it like that when you transfer it over to your references. So really make sure that for your references, you're following that. Let me open it up. That APA quick guide. There it is. The APA quick guide right here. Make sure that you're following this. And you can see that if it's not in all caps here, you don't need to put it in all caps. If it is in italics, put it in italics. If it is in sentence capitalization, leave it in sentence capitalization. Oh, that's the last thing I wanted to explain. So if you saw me writing use sentence capitalization, what that means is that in APA, in the title, in the references page only, these rules go out the window if you put the title into your paper. But in the reference pages for titles, we use what we call sentence capitalization, which means we capitalize the first letter of the first word of the title, first letter of the first word of the subtitle, and any proper nouns. So let me see if there's an example with a proper noun. Nope. But obviously, if you had, now there are no proper nouns in any of these examples. If you had something in here like the effects of watching TV on toddlers in America, then you would leave America capitalized. Like that, because it's a proper noun. Otherwise, lowercase. That's what sentence capitalization means. And those are just some random things to take forward when you look over your planner.